I know it went on a little too long.
I know absolutely nothing other than there was people protesting for something, but to be honest, I don't know what it's about.
Actually, really not too much about it.
What does it involve?
It's that movement that started on Wall Street.
Oh,
Occupy movement started not too long ago. It's been running about a year now. Primarily, it's a formless, faceless
grassroots movement, I'm guessing.
I guess it started with a good idea, I guess. People protesting corporate greed and stuff like that.
Basically, it's a large mob.
Probably not.
I don't think so.
TV news, no.
I think so. I mean, I like to see that people are protesting and getting their opinions across.
Yeah, they get more coverage than I think they should have.
I think it was more about propaganda, and they got a lot more of the negative energy of what they were trying to put out there.
On September 17, 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring protest, 2010 British student protests, and anti-austerity protests in Spain and Greece, Adbusters Media Foundation's Kale Lonson and Mika White emailed their subscribers with the idea of an encampment in Zuccotti Park located in New York City's Wall Street financial district. The Occupy movement's overarching grievance to address the problems of income inequality and wealth redistribution resonated with thousands of others. By October 9th, Occupy protests had risen in over 95 cities across 85 countries, with over 600 Occupy communities in the United States. This includes our very own Occupy Orlando. As the momentum grew for Occupy, so did the media coverage. According to a study by the Pew Research Center, 72% of adults closely follow the local news. Of those that follow the news closely, 80% use broadcast television as a source for local news on a weekly basis. So, from just consuming local TV news, what kind of images of Occupy Orlando are we being presented with? To find out, I conducted in-depth interviews with Orlando protesters, news people, and other experts, as well as a content analysis of local TV news coverage of Occupy Orlando. I limited my time frame from the inception of the Occupy movement to its highest point of coverage at the end of December 2011. Between November and December, widespread police action and evictions was what gained the most media attention. From what the public has access to online, I collected 34 clips that was aired on television from 4 local news networks. Although there were many local news stories of Occupy-related incidents outside of Orlando, I focused on stories only about Occupy Orlando, which amounted to a total of an hour and 12 minutes worth of coverage. Although images of Occupy movements outside of the Orlando area are not factored into this analysis of TV representations and framing, keep in mind that that does not mean that the inclusion of these images are not important to the construction of the image and understanding of the entire Occupy movement and Occupy Orlando. In a case study of local mainstream television news coverage of Occupy Orlando, the news consistently represented protesters superficially and framed them in such a way that did not allow for a more in-depth explanation of Occupy Orlando's missions and goals. Although I used the word fair to invite average citizens into the conversation of what kind of coverage was happening, my larger argument has less to do with equity and more to do with the system that journalism operates in, that inherently allows for some ideas to come across and for others to stay hidden. Specifically, the system of journalistic news values and institutionalized limitations restricted the ways in which Occupy Orlando protesters could be portrayed and understood on television. News values are a list of criteria journalists use in deciding what news is suitable for the public. These rationalized rules make the process of news gathering easier. Essentially, the more criteria a story satisfies, the more likely it will be chosen. Once a news piece has been chosen, the more likely the factors it was chosen for will be exaggerated, thus causing distortion. By closely adhering to these journalistic conventions, local TV news exaggerated certain aspects of Occupy Orlando. 3 news values are most evident in the coverage of Occupy Orlando. The focus on the unambiguity of marches, rallies, and other organized events is the first most evident.
Part of it has to do with, you know, how interesting it is on camera. I mean, one reason I got asked to cover it in the first place was because we knew it would be a lot of people out doing things where they were, you know, marching and shouting and yelling and dressed up and holding signs. And so when you have a group of people doing that, that's pretty easy video to shoot, and it's going to do well.
The general unambiguity of a rally, march, or other large body of people made it easy for journalists to report on the event. This satisfied the values of threshold and predictability, as news people could easily find and prepare for the rallies, marches, and encampments that have already been organized in advance. But the intense focus on only the event itself doesn't lend for critical, in-depth analysis. Instead, journalists only make general observations when reporting on a single event. It is easy to understand what the protesters are doing, but their reasons why are vague and are never fully elaborated in TV news reports. Reporters will comment on what one can see and the actions that protesters are taking, but will remain vague on anything that cannot be seen and might require more in-depth explanations, such as the mission and goals of the protesters.
To get their messages across to people who are driving across the Conroy Road Bridge over I-4. Occupy Orlando's plan today was to join forces with the local AFL-CIO and other union members on the bridge. We found former labor union members here, people with ties to labor unions. Some of these people have jobs, some don't, but they are here to push for a change so that more people can be hired. Today, the focus of the protesters was infrastructure.
And people want to see what it's all about, and they want to see who are these people that are in this big group, and what are they wearing, what are they shouting, and what are they doing, really. And it's kind of an easier thing sometimes to cover, instead of like a big, broad issue where, you know, you have to get different shots and different interviews. I mean, this is all right there, and it's all lively, and it's all action.
Out of the 34 newscasts studied, a total of 19 newscasts focus on the unambiguity of a rally, march, or other Occupy Orlando event.
They're only taking the tidbits of what's going bad instead of what we are doing for good. They're never out here when we're feeding people. They're out here when somebody got arrested.
Secondly, the news focused on the negativity of the conflict between police, city officials, and the Occupy Orlando protesters.
I mean, the moment you hear that people are getting arrested, as soon as you're down there and you get shots of that, I mean, people want to see people get arrested. I mean, it sounds terrible.
The news focused largely on the conflict of interest between protesters, city officials, police, and even other citizens. A large chunk of reporting was dedicated to when arrests were made and when occupiers were evicted from the park. Relying on these negative journalistic values exaggerated these aspects of the movement, to the point that it created tropes that the news consistently fell back on in order to contextualize the event, in a way that is easily understood and readily referable. One kind of trope is the protest paradigm, which is a consistent frame for most news coverage of protests, one that makes the controversial or violent aspects of the story and protest more salient than other aspects.
When they made that big eviction, that was during the day, and there was, 30 police officers there. I mean, that's good video. And knowing that that stuff's going to happen is a lot easier to plan and be there for. When TV covers, even us to some degree, the newspaper for video, when they cover, a murder or a robbery or whatever, a crime, generally they're not there when it happens. They're there for the aftermath. But like with the Occupy stuff and other things too, but specifically the Occupy stuff, you have people there that can talk about what they want to do, and you can actually get the action. So that's always a good thing.
There was a big eviction sometime in mid-December, and I think that was the night that we had the most news coverage, and it was because people were being ridiculous. Occupiers were screaming and chanting and calling the police bad names, and it just made for an interesting night story.
There's two kinds of people that might like to see those kids get, or I say kids, 20-year-olds arrested. There's people that say, well, those kids shouldn't be hanging out there anyway. They're just, they're just a bunch of lazy hippies. They want to see those kids get arrested. So that's people that want to watch that. And the other side, you have the people that support the Occupy movement, and they look at them and say, well, they shouldn't be getting arrested. They're just doing what their civil or their Constitution says they're allowed to do. So then they see the police as the aggressors, and so now you got two groups of people that love watching this stuff.
Out of the 34 newscasts studied, a total of 29 newscasts focus on the negativity and conflict between Occupy Orlando and city officials. Lastly, reporters focused on the general unusualness of the people, the act of occupying, and their demands.
Then over time, they stayed there, so that was kind of a new thing, occupying the park. And so everybody was there, all the TV stations, throughout the next week or so. They were going down there, talking to them, watching them camp out, and just kind of getting their take on, what the movement was all about at that point.
Not only does this fulfill the news values of unusual and interesting images and events, it simplifies the conversation about Occupy Orlando into descriptions of protesters' appearance, actions, and desires as deviant.
Our first General Assembly was on October 5th, 2011 in Orlando, and it was in front of the Regional History Center. And there were probably 300 people there. Big people in the community, some lawyers, some commissioners, just very active community members, and all of the news networks at the end of the assembly were interviewing this one man who went under the name of Reverend Fox.
What's your real name?
Can't give you.
Okay. Are you a reverend?
I am a legally ordained minister in the Church of the Subgenius.
Of the what?
And he was an anonymous member. He showed up to our first meeting at Lake Eola Park wearing a lab coat and a red scarf, and was very eccentric, and made it known that he was representing the anonymous and attempted to kind of take over as this figurehead. And the TV picked up on that. He was definitely a character. And instead of interviewing all of the people who stood up and spoke about their grievances, they wanted to get this guy on camera because he looked totally ridiculous and made the whole movement look really ridiculous in Orlando. And I don't think we ever recovered from that.
Because reporters emphasize protesters' deviance from the status quo, they may focus on things that ridicule,
raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour, universal health care, free college education, $1 trillion in infrastructure spending, and in some cases they're asking for complete debt forgiveness. Gary, what?
Free tickets to Disney, free tickets to SeaWorld.
vilify.
Tonight we found out some of the protesters are part of the hacker group Anonymous that's accused of attacking several Orlando websites.
Dismiss.
WESH 2 News has obtained some of the email complaints to the city, prompting Monday's code enforcement sweep and 7 arrests of demonstrators. And Ron Goins writes, the Occupy movement is nothing but illegal squatters.
Or delegitimize protesters.
They're treated like slaves. And for minimum
But I mean, have you talked to the people building at this site and asked them if they're getting benefits and are receiving pay and vacation?
I have personally not talked to them about their jobs.
Successful social movements successfully demonstrate what they call WUNC, an acronym, not WUNC, I don't know if you've heard of it, but W is worthiness, that their cause is worthy, and not just their cause, but they as sort of members of the cause are worthy. U is unity, that they have a unified front. N is numbers, that they have sufficient numbers that matter, that people will pay attention to. And C is commitment, where they're not just there, one time to sign a petition or click a button, but they care. And I would say that, my own analysis of the Occupy movement is, I think they've certainly demonstrated commitment in terms of they're out there, sleeping in the parks, staying in the parks for a significant amount of time. They have generated a lot of numbers. I think that's great. Unity, yeah, I think they their decision-making process is has sort of generated a sense of unity to some extent. The worthiness thing, I don't think they've won that battle entirely yet, this kind of worthiness thing, and that's not just about the issues they're covering, but this kind of ability to marginalize them because they dress funny or look like hippies or whatever.
They just didn't take it very seriously. I think I saw it on a lot of talk shows and people just discussing the silly aspects of the grievances, and they want to annihilate money, and they you know, but they use computers, so what are they thinking? It was just, they kept on that level where they didn't attempt to understand the movement.
It can be said that all 34 newscasts depicted the news value of unexpectedness because of the unique and unusual ideas and events that the Occupy movement and Occupy Orlando created as a whole. As mainstream news exists to confirm mainstream ideas, the iconoclastic culture of Occupy Orlando was an easy target to turn into a spectacle. From the clips analyzed, 10 stood out as especially focused on the unexpectedness or unusualness of an Occupy Orlando protester event, idea, or appearance. The organization of broadcast newsmaking does not allow for elaborate, in-depth explanations. This means that news as an institution inherently allows some ideas to be covered and ignores other ideas. Reasons for this are the need for constant news updates on the current 24-hour news cycle, and the pressure to remain unbiased and source individuals. The 24-hour news cycle, rather than informing the audience more, creates an emphasis on competition amongst news organizations and makes news deadline-driven and profit-oriented.
I mean, you can't wait at all. I mean, before, I don't even know what life would be like as a reporter where I could be like, well, that story's not going to run until tomorrow, I can go home now. Whereas now, if something happens at noon, I need to have something done by 1. A lot of it, though, too, when you do cover things like that are kind of region-wide issues, you do get pushed into some stories because everybody else is covering it. So, whereas, I might not cover every step that the Occupy movement took normally, but because TV was, we have to too. I mean, that's just kind of a competition thing. I mean, if TV is going to be there covering arrest, I got to go cover arrest. If TV is going to be at court, I got to be at court. And, I don't know how they do it, but I would assume they do kind of the same thing. If they see a story we write for the front page and they weren't covering it the day before, they're probably going to cover it the next day. And so some of it fuels, the competition. You see what they're doing, well, we got to do that too, and vice versa.
In addition, the rise of digital and social media has forced newsmakers to now translate news across multiple platforms. This kind of organization ultimately does not allow time for thorough, in-depth analysis.
There's a lot more, I guess, pressures out there to get everything done and get it done fast because you have all kinds of other people doing it too. And that's not just, those are just people getting paid to do it. I mean, think of all the bloggers out there too that are writing things, and you got to somewhat compete with them too. And they might just write it from their iPhone at the scene, which is what we do too sometimes. But it's sometimes hard to do that when you want to go into depth on things. It's hard to type in a whole story on your little phone.
I don't think that anyone really had the time or energy to come out as often as they should have, really. And that's not what local news really does. They summarize things in 2-minute segments and that's it. But I don't think a movement to overthrow the entire system of the way that the U.S. government functions is something that can be summarized in 2 minutes.
I mean, as long as we have a commercial media, right, their incentives are going to be commercial ones. What are people going to watch? And so do people tend to watch more in-depth explanation of the underlying reasons and causes of movements like this? No, right? People don't tend to watch those kinds of things. People tend to watch more sensationalized kinds of images and other things. Conflict. They want to see conflict. They want to see good and evil, and so forth. And so this is what the local and national media are gonna, that's how they're gonna frame events, because, you know, they need to sell ratings.
And it's not just my job to cover Occupy Orlando. I mean, I had all kinds of other things I was doing while I'm doing that, so it's hard for me to just do this one thing. I mean, I could have wrote a story every day on them. I mean, I could have found something to write about, but at some point you gotta, I have other jobs. And so, you know, to the best of my ability, I tried to, you know, cover them and talk to them and get their views out. When they got arrested, I wrote stories about them getting arrested. When they were doing marches, when they were planning things, I tried to get that out there as best I could. I mean, you can always cover things better. You know, if you have more staff or have more time or more space, I mean, you can always find better angles. It's just, you really can't do it every day, though. I mean, you can, but I can't do it. I couldn't do it every single day, just because it just wouldn't work out that way for how it is at the paper.
In mid-October of 2011, when everything started popping up everywhere, media was quick to jump on it. Clearly, you know, it's new news. But I think something that became a problem was that new organized movements didn't necessarily mean new missions or goals that were already in consensus with the group. The media needed to have patience with the waiting period of daily general assemblies when each group could build consensus on their collective goals. And they were telling news networks for 2 months, we don't have our collective goals, you know, nailed down yet. We need time to discuss, and we need time to all agree on what we're going to put out to the media. And no one wanted to say anything before it was reached with consensus, because that would be counterproductive to the movement. But then no one stuck around to wait after things were decided.
Because the news inherently individualizes issues and events discussed on TV, reporters could not wrap their head around the broad, complex, and varied missions of Occupy Orlando. This is how news only vaguely described the missions, goals, and grievances of Occupy Orlando.
Like I said, there's no spokesperson, which doesn't help either. I mean, generally when you go out to events, you know, there might be somebody there who can kind of help you out and tell you, this is what our stance is, this is what we believe. Well, like with the Occupy, there was nobody really to do that, and so, and that's how they planned it. They said, none of us are the leader, which is fine. It's just, it's hard to it's hard to write about it, and then you do, let's say you do quote someone, or you do get somebody on camera and they say something. Well, you might get an email the next day and say, well, that's not what our movement's about. Well, to you, that's not what the movement's about, but I talked to this person, that's what they said. Well, they don't speak for all of us. Well, then how am I supposed to cover this?
The whole horizontal organization thing, and how it became really difficult for anyone to represent the movement, because no single person that they could interview could tell them what it was about. Because they needed to do a lot more work to get an accurate sample. But I think that that's just not the way that they're used to functioning. They're used to just getting like a soundbite from some person who seemed vocal and then slapping that on the news, and it was fine. But in this case, it wasn't fine.
Occupy movement is hard for journalists to deal with because they are diverse and rather explicitly don't have a leader or a voice. And so you have to deal with trying to reflect a multiplicity of views, many of which are at odds. That can be done, but it takes time. And then you have to have readers willing to put some time into reading a more complicated story. So it's a little tricky.
The way that Occupy functions, I'm going to put it in present tense, is completely diametrically opposed to like the system that the media operates within. And that's something I don't think we can place fault on either the media or the occupiers for not articulating. But I do think that very few media outlets actually attempted to understand.
From watching local TV coverage alone, where most average citizens obtain the daily news, one cannot draw any conclusions on what Occupy is about, what their goals are, or what they're trying to do to achieve those goals. When it came down to how Occupy Orlando was covered in local television news networks, a strict adherence to journalistic news values and institutional restrictions of news networks affected how protesters were portrayed. It led to a limited, oversimplified frame that protesters were restricted to, and did not allow for an elaborate discussion on the issues Occupy Orlando were concerned about. Although journalists used their news values and routines to remain clear and objective, these same conventions failed to unpack the complexity of Occupy Orlando.